remember the exact moment it all fell apart. My name's Lena. I'm 33, and honestly, I should have known better. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, the plates still on the table because neither of us had the energy to clean up. He was scrolling through his phone, probably reading some article or checking scores. I was sipping on a lukewarm cup of tea that had gone bitter from neglect. It wasn't a fight, not at first. Just one of those meandering conversations couples have when there's nothing left to say, but silence feels too loud. I don't even remember how we got onto the topic of marriage. Maybe he'd mentioned someone from work getting engaged, or one of those cheesy anniversary posts that pop up on social media. You know, I said, without really thinking, if real men had been around, I probably wouldn't have married you. I meant it as a joke, sort of. He glanced up from his phone, his brow furrowing just enough to make me realize I'd hit a nerve. I laughed, trying to smooth it over. You know what I mean, I added, waving a hand like that would erase the sting. It was slim pickings back then. Silence, he went back to his phone, or at least pretended to, but the air had changed, thickening with something unsaid. I told myself it was fine, he was just being sensitive, but deep down I knew better. We'd been teetering on the edge for months, maybe even years. Marriage wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. I mean, who goes into it thinking it's going to be mundane and filled with grocery lists, mismatched socks, and arguments about the thermostat? But still, I had expectations. And he was steady, reliable, a rock when I needed one. The problem was rocks don't spark. I told myself I was lucky. He was a good man. Kind, patient, never raised his voice. But sometimes I wanted more than kind. I wanted passion, fire, someone who would challenge me instead of nodding along or quietly retreating whenever things got tense. Maybe that's why I said what I did, or maybe I was just being cruel. He stood up after a while, stretching as if he hadn't heard a thing. I'm going to bed, he said, his voice calm but distant. Already? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone. It's barely 9. I'm tired. And just like that, he walked away. I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, my chest tightening with a mix of guilt and defiance. I told myself he'd get over it. He always did. That was the thing about him. He never stayed mad. But this time felt different. I finished my tea, grimacing at the bitterness, and finally got up to clear the table. The clatter of plates and silverware echoed through the quiet house, amplifying the loneliness creeping in around me. By the time I crawled into bed, he was already turned away, breathing evenly like he was asleep. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind replaying the evening over and over. Why had I said that? What was wrong with me? But even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my conscience, resentment simmered just beneath the surface. Why did he have to be so passive? Why couldn't he fight back, say something, anything, instead of retreating into that stoic shell of his? The next morning, he was up before me, as usual. I found him in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the news on his tablet. Morning, I said, forcing a smile. Morning. The word hung between us, thin and fragile. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence stretching unbearably. About last night, I began, but he cut me off. Don't worry about it. His tone was so even, so devoid of emotion that it made my chest ache. I didn't mean it, I said, though part of me wondered if that was entirely true. He nodded, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I know. And just like that, it was done, or so I thought. But something had shifted, a fault line cracking beneath the surface of our carefully constructed life. I could feel it even if I couldn't see it yet. That day dragged on, filled with the mundane tasks that make up a life, emails, laundry, errands. But the weight of that conversation lingered, pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. By the time he got home from work, I was wound so tight I could snap. I wanted to apologize again, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I asked, "How was your day?" Fine. One word, clipped and distant. Dinner was quiet, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. I kept glancing at him, hoping for a sign that things were okay, that we were okay. But he was polite, distant, like a stranger sharing a meal out of obligation. As the days passed, his distance grew more pronounced. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still asked if I needed anything from the store, but there was a hollowness to it all. Like he was going through the motions without really being there. I told myself it was fine. He'd come around, but deep down I knew better. The days stretched into a tense routine. I went through them pretending everything was normal, even as the weight of his silence grew heavier. He wasn't outright cold, no slammed doors or harsh words. That would have been easier to deal with, honestly. It was the polite distance that cut the deepest. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space, careful not to bump into each other emotionally. Every "how was your day?" and "you need anything from the store?" felt like a hollow echo of the conversations we used to have. I wanted to fix it, to take back that stupid comment, but every time I opened my mouth to apologize, pride held me back. I shouldn't have to grovel, I told myself. It was just a joke, not a declaration of war. He was blowing it out of proportion. But late at night, when I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the nagging voice whispering that I was wrong. The truth was, I didn't just hurt him, I disrespected him. And worse, I'd done it so casually, without even thinking. The guilt gnawed at me, but instead of softening my defenses, it made me bitter. Resentment crept in, twisting my thoughts until I convinced myself that he should be the one apologizing for making me feel this way. So instead of reaching out, I pulled back too. We became two islands, separated by an ocean of unsaid words. One evening, about a week after the comment that had started it all, I decided to break the cycle. I couldn't take the silence anymore. I'd make dinner, something special, and maybe that would bridge the gap. I spent the afternoon cooking his favorite meal, beef stew with crusty bread from the bakery downtown. The house filled with the comforting aroma of simmering spices and slow-cooked meat. I set the table, lit a couple of candles, and waited for him to come home. When I heard his car pull into the driveway, my heart raced. This was it. My olive branch. He walked in, his tie loosened and face weary from the day. "Hey," he said, glancing around. "What's all this?" "Thought I'd make a nice dinner," I said, forcing a smile. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Smells good." We sat down to eat, the candles flickering between us. I waited for him to take the first bite, my nerves fraying with every second of silence. "This is really good," he finally said. Relief washed over me. "Thanks, I thought it might be nice to do something different." He nodded, but didn't say anything else. The conversation faltered before it even began. I kept trying to find openings, asking about his day, mentioning a funny story I'd read online, but his answers were short, polite, and distant. By the time we finished eating, the weight in my chest had returned, heavier than ever. "I miss this," I blurted out as he stood to clear his plate. He paused, his back to me. "Miss what? Us talking, being close." He turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I do," he nodded, setting his plate down on the counter. "Funny, because it didn't seem that way when you said what you said." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the words died on my tongue. "I get it," he continued, his tone calm but cutting. "Maybe I wasn't what you wanted, maybe you settled." "I didn't," he held up a hand, stopping me. "It's okay, I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. Maybe you're right." The room tilted beneath me. "What are you talking about?" "I think I need some time," he said quietly. "Time for what?" My voice cracked. "To figure out if this is what I want too." Panic surged through me. "You can't be serious." He looked at me with a kind of sadness that made my chest ache. "I love you, Lena, but I can't keep being the only one fighting for this." And just like that, he walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, the candles burning down to nothing. I stood there, frozen, the warmth from the dinner I had poured my heart into turning cold on the plates. The quiet hum of the dishwasher filled the silence he left behind, a poor substitute for his presence. He was always calm, measured, even in conflict. But this time, his calmness felt like a verdict. And the worst part, I couldn't even argue against it because deep down I knew he was right, but knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. I cleaned up the dishes mechanically, scrubbing furiously at spots that didn't even exist. My mind raced with 1,000 what-ifs. What if I had never made that comment? What if I had swallowed my pride and apologized sooner? What if I had been better, more loving, more grateful, more everything he deserved? By the time I finished cleaning, my hands were raw, and my chest ached from the effort of holding myself together. I wanted to go after him, to demand that he come back and talk to me, fight with me, anything but leave me alone in this silence. But I stayed rooted to the spot, too proud or too scared. I wasn't sure which. Later, I found him in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The sight of him like that, looking as lost as I felt, broke something inside me. I don't want to lose you, I said softly, leaning against the door frame. He didn't look up. I don't think you do, Lena. I think you don't want to be alone. There's a difference. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. That's not fair, isn't it? He finally met my gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. You said it yourself, if real men had been around, you wouldn't have married me. That's a hard thing to unhear. I was joking, I insisted, though my voice wavered. You know I didn't mean it like that. Maybe you didn't, he said, his tone gentle but firm. But it came from somewhere, didn't it? I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth clung to me like a second skin. I had married him because he was safe, steady, a good man. And while I loved him, there was a part of me that had always wondered if I'd settled. Not because of who he was, but because of who I wasn't. I don't know why I said it, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's the problem, Lena. I don't think you know what you want. The weight of his words pressed down on me, but I refused to let them crush me. I want you, I said fiercely. I chose you. But did you really? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body but not touching. I know I've been difficult, I said, my voice trembling. I've taken you for granted and I'm sorry. I've been scared. Scared of what? Of getting it wrong, of not being enough, of waking up one day and realizing I've messed everything up beyond repair. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. You're not the only one who's scared, Lena, but you have to let me in. You can't just push me away every time things get hard. I know. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. I'm trying. I swear I'm trying. We sat there in silence, the weight of our unspoken fears and regrets settling between us. I need time, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. To figure out what I want, and I think you need time too. Panic surged through me again. Time apart, he nodded. Just a little space. I'll stay at my brother's for a while. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Okay, the word tasted bitter, but I swallowed it down. He stood, grabbing an overnight bag from the corner of the room. I'll call you, he promised. I nodded, my chest aching with the effort of holding myself together. When he walked out the door, I felt a part of me go with him. The house was too quiet, too empty without him. I curled up on the guest room bed, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that clung to the pillows. I told myself it wasn't over. He'd come back. We'd figure it out, but the doubt lingered, whispering insidious thoughts in the dark. What if this was the beginning of the end? What if I had finally pushed him too far? What if love wasn't enough to fix what I'd broken? The days without him stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. Mornings were the worst. I'd wake up and instinctively reach for him, only to find the empty space where he used to be. The house felt cavernous, every creak and groan amplifying the loneliness. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning, reorganizing closets that didn't need reorganizing, even starting a garden I had no idea how to maintain. But no amount of productivity could drown out the gnawing ache in my chest. At night, I replayed our last conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every pause, searching for a way I could have changed the outcome. If I had been softer, more apologetic, would he still be here? My phone became both a lifeline and a tormentor. I checked it constantly, hoping for a text or call from him. But days passed, and there was nothing. I hated how desperate I felt, how raw and exposed I had become without him here to anchor me. One afternoon, my cousin Maya showed up unannounced, her vibrant energy a stark contrast to the gloom that had settled over my home. Hey, she said, breezing past me into the living room. You look like you've been living on coffee and regrets. I managed a weak smile. That obvious. She flopped onto the couch, kicking off her heels. What's going on? You and Mark okay? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Meyer and I had always been close, but talking about this felt like admitting defeat. Still, I needed someone to hear me. We're taking some time apart, I finally said, her eyes widened. Seriously, what happened? I sank into the armchair across from her, wrapping my arms around myself. I said something stupid, really stupid. She waited, her expression urging me to continue. I told him I married him because real men weren't around, I confessed, my voice thick with shame. Maya's jaw dropped. You did not. I did. Damn, Lena, that's brutal. I know. She shook her head, a mixture of disbelief and sympathy on her face. Why would you say something like that? I don't know, I admitted, frustration bubbling up. It just came out. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but I think part of me was lashing out. I've been feeling so, stuck, I guess, and instead of dealing with it, I took it out on him. Maya sighed, leaning forward. Look, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. That was a low blow. But if he loves you, he'll come back. You just have to be honest with him. I tried, I said bitterly. He said he needs time. Then give it to him. But don't sit around beating yourself up, okay? That's not going to help anyone. She stayed for a while, distracting me with stories about work and her latest dating escapades. For a moment, I almost felt normal again. But after she left, the silence crept back in, wrapping itself around me like a heavy cloak. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The neighborhood was quiet, the golden light of early evening casting long shadows on the pavement. I passed by families playing in their yards, the sound of laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. It was a stark reminder of everything I was missing. As I rounded the corner back toward my house, I spotted Mark's car parked in the driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. He was back. I quickened my pace, anticipation and nervousness warring within me. But as I got closer, I saw her, Maya, standing by his car, laughing at something he said. My feet faltered, the scene unfolding before me like a nightmare I couldn't escape. She leaned in, her hand brushing his arm in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. He didn't pull away. My chest tightened, a cold knot of disbelief forming in my stomach. Maya, of all people. I stood there, frozen, watching as they continued talking, completely oblivious to my presence. Rage and heartbreak surged through me, hot and overwhelming. I wanted to march over there, demand an explanation, scream until the ache in my chest subsided. But I couldn't move. Instead, I turned and walked away, my vision blurred with tears. I walked aimlessly, my mind reeling, heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and fury. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was wading through thick, unrelenting grief. Maya and Mark, together, talking, laughing. That image was seared into my brain, playing on a relentless loop. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe he was just being polite. But no matter how hard I tried, the weight of doubt pressed harder on my chest. Why hadn't he told me he was talking to her? Why was she even here? My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me from my spiraling thoughts. I pulled it out and saw Maya's name flashing on the screen. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something inside me snapped. I hit accept and brought the phone to my ear. "Lena," she said, her voice too cheerful. "Where'd you disappear to? I was just at your place." "I saw you," I said flatly. There was a pause, just long enough for my suspicion to harden into certainty. "Oh," she said, her tone faltering. "You saw us talking. Talking, that's all it was, right?" "Just a harmless conversation." "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "Looked cozy." "Come on, don't be like that," she said, attempting a laugh. "We were just catching up. He ran into me at the cafe earlier and we got to talking. I figured I'd stop by and say hi." I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around the phone. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said, her voice defensive now. "I was trying to cheer you up earlier, remember? Mark and I are just friends." Friends, the word tasted bitter on my tongue. "Right," I said, swallowing down the lump in my throat. "Thanks for the heads up, Lena." I hung up before she could finish, my hands shaking. The rational part of me knew I was jumping to conclusions, but the hurt part didn't care. I couldn't shake the image of them standing there, comfortable in each other's presence while I was unraveling. By the time I made it back home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Mark's car was gone, and the house loomed dark and silent. I stepped inside, the emptiness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of what I'd lost, or was in the process of losing. I paced the living room, my thoughts churning. Was I overreacting? Maybe Maya was right. It wasn't a big deal. But why did it feel like betrayal gnawing at my insides? I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would dull the edge of my emotions. But instead, the alcohol only fueled my anger. Before I knew it, I was dialing his number, my heart racing with every ring. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. "Lena, were you going to tell me?" I demanded, skipping any pleasantries. "Tell you what?" "About Maya." There was a pause. "What about her?" "You were talking to her outside the house." He sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. "Yeah, we ran into each other. She stopped by for a minute. It wasn't a big deal." "Not a big deal," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Funny how you didn't think to mention it." "Because it didn't mean anything," he said, his tone sharpening. "You're reading too much into this." "Am I?" "Yes, you are," he said firmly. "Look, I get that things are tense between us right now, but this isn't helping. So it's my fault." "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying, Mark?" "I'm saying that maybe this time apart is exactly what we need if this is how you're going to react." His words hit me like a slap. "You're really doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "You're leaving me for her, aren't you?" "What?" He sounded genuinely shocked. "Lena, that's not—" "I saw the way she looked at you." I cut him off, my voice rising. "And the way you didn't stop her." "This isn't about Maya," he said firmly. "This is about us, and the fact that we've been falling apart for a while now." The truth of his words stung, but I wasn't ready to hear it. "Fine," I said, my voice cold. "Go ahead, run off to my cousin, see if I care." "Lena." I hung up, my chest heaving with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. The room spun around me and I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. I had driven him away. And now I might have lost him for good. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a heart weighed down by regret. The wine from the night before had done nothing but sharpen my insecurities and fuel a conversation I wasn't proud of. I reached for my phone, hesitating before unlocking it. Part of me hoped Mark had called or sent a message, something to ease the gnawing ache inside me. But the screen was blank, no notifications, no missed calls. I tossed the phone onto the couch and let out a bitter laugh. What had I expected? That he'd chase after me, beg me to stop being unreasonable. Maya's presence still lingered in my mind, her laugh echoing like a taunt. I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened between them, but doubt clung to me, whispering dark possibilities I couldn't ignore. Needing air, I threw on a jacket and headed out for a walk. The crisp morning air stung my cheeks, but it did little to clear my swirling thoughts. I wandered aimlessly, my feet carrying me past familiar streets and neighborhood landmarks. Children played in front yards, their laughter piercing the quiet. Couples walked hand in hand, their closeness a painful reminder of what I was missing. I found myself near the cafe where Mark and I used to spend lazy Sunday mornings, sipping coffee and reading the paper in comfortable silence. The memory made my chest ache. As I stood there, lost in thought, a voice pulled me back to the present. "Lena." I turned, my heart sinking as I recognized Maya standing a few feet away. She wore a bright yellow sweater, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She looked effortlessly put together while I felt like a frayed version of myself. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "Getting coffee," she said, holding up a to-go cup. "You?" "Just walking." An awkward silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken tension. "Look," she said, stepping closer, "can we talk?" "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said stiffly. "Come on, Lena," she sighed. "You're mad at me and I get it, but you're blowing this whole thing out of proportion." "Am I?" "Yes," she insisted. "Mark and I are just friends, always have been, always will be. I would never do that to you." Her words hung in the air, but I couldn't shake the lingering doubt. "Then why did it look like you were flirting with him?" I demanded, my voice rising. She blinked, taken aback. "Flirting, Lena, seriously. I was trying to cheer him up because he looked like someone had kicked his dog. That someone being you, by the way." Her bluntness stung, but I forced myself to stay composed. "You have no idea what's going on between us," I said tightly. "You're right, I don't," she admitted. "But I do know that you're pushing him away and it's not going to fix anything." I crossed my arms over my chest, the defensiveness rising like a shield. "So now you're the relationship expert?" she sighed, her expression softening. "Lena, I'm not the enemy here. I love you and I want you to be happy, but you can't keep sabotaging yourself like this." Her words cut through my anger, leaving behind a raw vulnerability I didn't want to face. My voice faltered. "I'm scared I've already lost him." "You haven't," she said gently. "But you need to figure out what you really want, and if it's Mark, you have to fight for him, not push him away." The weight of her advice settled over me. I hated that she was right. "I'll think about it," I said grudgingly. "That's all I'm asking," she said with a small smile. "Now go home and shower. You look like you've been in a brawl with your emotions." Despite myself, I laughed, a small, reluctant sound. As I watched her walk away, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days: hope. Maybe things weren't beyond repair. Maybe I could fix this if I found the courage to face my fears and be honest with Mark and myself. But first, I had to figure out what that honesty looked like, and whether I was brave enough to speak it aloud. Back home, the house was just as I'd left it, silent, heavy with the absence of Mark. I stood in the entryway for a moment, the weight of Maya's words pressing on my chest. "Fight for him," she'd said. But how could I fight for something when I wasn't even sure he wanted to be fought for? I dragged myself to the couch and sank into it, my head throbbing with exhaustion. Memories of us played like a cruel montage. Mark laughing as we cooked dinner together, his arms slung around me as we walked through city streets, the quiet comfort of his presence during sleepless nights. I knew I hadn't been fair to him. My sharp words, my defensiveness, it all came from a place I hadn't been brave enough to confront. Fear. Not just fear of losing him, but fear that I wasn't enough. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that loving Mark meant proving I didn't need him, as if dependence was weakness. But now, in his absence, I realized how much I had relied on him, not just for companionship, but for grounding me when my own insecurities threatened to consume me. I needed to tell him the truth. The thought made my stomach twist, but I knew it was the only way forward. I couldn't let pride or fear dictate my actions anymore. I grabbed my phone and stared at his number, my thumb hovering over the call button. The words I wanted to say swirled in my head, tangled and messy. What if he didn't want to hear them? What if he'd already decided we were done? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I pushed past it and pressed call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. My pulse quickened with each ring until it finally clicked over to voicemail. "Hey, it's Mark, leave a message." I froze, the automated beep jolting me into silence. My thoughts scattered, and all I managed to say was, "It's me, we need to talk." I hung up, frustration bubbling to the surface. That wasn't how I'd wanted it to go. Restless, I paced the living room, debating whether to text him instead. But before I could decide, the doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat. I rushed to the door, hope and nerves tangling inside me. When I opened it, Mark stood on the other side, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I breathed, my voice shaky. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside and he walked in, his presence filling the space in a way that both comforted and unsettled me. He glanced around as if taking stock of the familiar surroundings. "Been a while," he said quietly. "Yeah," I admitted, my throat tightening. We settled on opposite ends of the couch, an awkward distance between us that felt foreign and painful. "I got your message," he said after a beat. "I didn't say much," I said, my voice faltering. "I figured there was more you wanted to say." There it was, the opening I needed, but now that I had it, the words stuck in my throat. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, "for everything." He watched me, his expression unreadable. "Go on." I took a shaky breath. "I said things I didn't mean. I was angry and I lashed out, but the truth is, I was scared of losing you, scared that maybe you deserved better than me." His brows furrowed. "Why would you think that?" "Because I've been pushing you away," I admitted, tears stinging my eyes. "And I don't even know why sometimes. It's like I'm trying to prove I don't need you, but I do, Mark. I need you. I love you, and I'm sorry if I made you feel like that wasn't enough." The silence that followed was deafening. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You hurt me, Lena," he said, his voice low. That comment, it cut deep. I've always tried to be the man you needed, but hearing that, it made me question everything. "I know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was stupid and selfish, and I hate that I made you feel that way." He exhaled slowly, as if releasing some of the tension he'd been holding onto. "I didn't come here to rehash the past," he said. "I came because I needed to see if we still have a future." Hope flickered in my chest. "Do we?" "That depends," he said, his gaze steady. "Are you willing to let me in this time? No walls, no games?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want to be better for you, for us." A long pause stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything we'd been through. "Then let's try," he said softly. Relief washed over me, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe again. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. But for the first time I was willing to fight for us. Really fight, not from a place of fear or defensiveness, but from love. The days that followed were tentative, like walking on glass, careful steps, cautious words, neither of us wanting to shatter the fragile truce we'd built. Mark was back, but things weren't the same. There was an unspoken heaviness between us, the weight of past wounds that neither of us knew how to fully address. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance, every pause in conversation. Was he thinking about what I'd said? Did he still see me as the woman who had doubted his worth? Or was he willing to believe I could be different? One evening, as we sat on the couch in relative silence, I couldn't take it anymore. "This isn't working, is it?" I blurted out, my heart racing. Mark set down the book he'd been pretending to read and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I mean this. Us." I gestured between us, my voice trembling. "We're acting like everything's fine, but it's not. I can feel it." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I think we're both afraid of saying the wrong thing again." "I know I am," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "Me too." The honesty hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. "I hate that I hurt you," I said softly. "And I hate that I keep wondering if you're waiting for me to mess up again." His gaze softened. "Lena, I'm not keeping score. But trust takes time to rebuild. I'm scared I won't know how to fix this," I confessed, tears threatening to spill. "You don't have to fix it alone," he said, reaching for my hand. "We both messed up and we both have to work on this." The warmth of his touch steadied me, but doubt still lingered. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He was quiet for a moment, and my chest tightened. "I thought about it," he admitted. "But then I realized that I love you too much to walk away without trying." His words were both a balm and a challenge. He was here, willing to fight, but only if I was too. "I'm scared I'll push you away again," I whispered. "Then tell me when you're scared," he said. "Don't hide it behind walls or sharp words. Just be honest with me, even if it's messy." I nodded, the weight in my chest easing just a bit. Later that night, as we lay side by side in bed, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. We weren't fixed, not by a long shot, but we were trying. And maybe that was enough for now. But life, as always, had a way of throwing unexpected curveballs. The next afternoon, as I was sorting through the mail, a glossy wedding invitation slipped from the pile and fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, my breath catching in my throat as I read the names printed in elegant script, Meyer and Daniel. I stared at the invitation, my mind reeling. Daniel was Maya's on-again, off-again boyfriend, the one she always swore she'd never marry. And yet here it was, a wedding announcement, complete with a date just 2 months away. A strange mix of emotions churned inside me, relief that it wasn't Mark's name next to hers, followed by guilt for even thinking that. But there was something else, too, a nagging unease I couldn't quite shake. I tucked the invitation back into the envelope and tried to push the thoughts aside. This was a good thing, right? Maya was moving on with her life, and that meant I could fully let go of the irrational fears that had haunted me. But as I glanced toward the living room where Mark was reading, a sliver of doubt crept in. What if some part of me had been holding on to those fears as a way to avoid facing the deeper issues between us? And now that they were gone, what excuse would I have left? The thought unsettled me, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. If we were going to make this work, I had to confront not just my fears about Maya, but my fears about myself, and whether I was truly capable of being the partner Mark deserved. The night of Maya and Daniel's wedding arrived faster than I expected. Despite my initial resolve to brush it off, the invitation sat on our kitchen counter like a silent dare. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a wedding. People got married all the time. But deep down, I knew I was dreading it. Mark stood by the mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. His reflection caught my eye, handsome and composed, the very picture of stability. How many times had I wondered if I was enough for him? Tonight, those doubts pressed harder than ever. "You ready?" he asked, glancing over at me. I smoothed down the silky fabric of my dress, trying to ignore the knot twisting in my stomach. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the venue was filled with polite small talk. and an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite place. I kept my gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the streetlights blurring into golden streaks against the dark sky. We arrived at a grand event hall draped in twinkling lights and lush greenery. The air buzzed with excitement as guests milled about, their laughter and chatter filling the space. I plastered on a polite smile, but my heart raced as I scanned the crowd for familiar faces. Maya was radiant in her lace gown, her smile wide and genuine as she greeted guests. She spotted us and waved, her expression warm and welcoming. "You made it," she said, pulling me into a hug. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Wouldn't miss it," I managed, though my voice wavered. Mark shook hands with Daniel, exchanging pleasantries. I watched them, feeling like an outsider in my own skin. "You look amazing," Maya said, her tone sincere. "Thanks, so do you," I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. As she moved on to greet other guests, Mark and I found our seats at a table near the dance floor. The ceremony had been beautiful, a picture-perfect celebration of love. But as the evening wore on, I felt increasingly out of place. Mark was chatting easily with a group of people, his laughter ringing out like music. I sipped my champagne, the bubbles doing little to ease my nerves. "You okay?" he asked, leaning closer. "Yeah," I lied. He gave me a knowing look. "You sure?" "I just need some air," I said, standing abruptly. He watched me go, concern flickering in his eyes, but he didn't follow. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around me like a balm. I leaned against the railing, staring up at the stars scattered across the sky. I hated that I felt this way, jealous, insecure, like I was still competing with ghosts that didn't even exist. Maya was married now, happily moving forward with her life. And here I was, still grappling with fears I couldn't fully name. Footsteps sounded behind me and I tensed, expecting Mark. But it was Maya. "Thought I'd find you out here," she said softly. I forced a smile. "Just needed a breather. Weddings can be overwhelming," she said, leaning beside me. "Especially when they stir up old stuff." I glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "Old stuff," she shrugged. "I know things were weird between us for a while. I never wanted that." "I know," I admitted. "I guess I made it weird." She smiled gently. "We're all just trying to figure things out, aren't we?" Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. "I'm happy for you," I said quietly. "Thanks," she said. "And I hope you find your happiness too, Lena. You deserve it." As she walked back inside, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Maybe it was time to let go of the jealousy, the insecurities, the fear. I found Mark waiting for me by the door, his expression soft. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "I think I am." We stood there for a moment, the night wrapping around us like a quiet promise. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe we had a chance, because I was finally ready to let go of the past and fight for the future we both deserved. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft golden patterns across the bed. Mark was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady and calm. I lay there, watching him, a quiet sense of gratitude blooming in my chest. Last night had been a turning point, though not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic revelations that mattered. It was something simpler, the realization that I didn't have to keep holding onto the past like it was some shield protecting me from pain. All it had done was keep me stuck, afraid to believe I could be happy. Mark stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked at me, a sleepy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning," I whispered back. He stretched, his arm brushing against mine. "What time is it?" "Early, go back to sleep if you want." He shook his head lightly. "Nah, I like this, waking up with you." His words were simple, but they held a weight I didn't take for granted anymore. "I like it too," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. As we lay there in comfortable silence, I thought about how far we'd come, not just as a couple, but individually. Mark had always been steady, but now I saw the effort it took for him to stay that way when I'd tested every boundary he had. And I was learning to let down my walls, to stop hiding behind sarcasm and fear. It wouldn't be perfect. We were still figuring it out, still healing. But we were trying. Later, as we shared coffee in the kitchen, Mark's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it and frowned slightly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just my sister. She wants to meet for brunch next weekend." I smiled. "Family time sounds good." He looked at me thoughtfully. I've been thinking maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us. Really? Yeah. Get away from everything for a bit. Focus on us. The idea made my heart lift. I'd love that. Good, he said, a hint of relief in his voice. We fell into easy conversation, the kind that didn't need to fill every silence but felt natural and warm. It was in those quiet moments that I realized love wasn't about grand declarations or picture-perfect scenes. It was in the everyday choices, to show up, to forgive, to stay even when it was hard. Mark reached for my hand across the table, his touch grounding me. I'm glad we're here, he said softly. Me too, I whispered, and I meant it. There was no neat resolution, no guarantee of forever, but that was okay. Life was messy, unpredictable, and beautiful in its imperfection. As I looked into Mark's eyes, I knew one thing for certain. I was done hiding from love, done sabotaging my own happiness. I was ready to choose us every day with all the vulnerability and courage that took. And for now, that was more than enough. If you've ever struggled with love, loss, or finding yourself amidst the chaos of a relationship, I hope this story reminded you that healing is messy, but worth it. Choosing love, even when it's hard, begins with choosing yourself first. Let me know your thoughts. Have you ever had to fight for love or learn to let go of the past? I'd love to hear your story.